As we get started today, I want to remind you of a couple things. First off is that the second set of summaries is due a week from today, so don't forget that. Also, don't forget that the exam is a week from Thursday, so a week and a half from today. The study guide is available on Blackboard, so if you have any questions, please let me know. We can get together and talk about it, work through that. But let me know what I can do to help you with that. So we're still in the early medieval period. Roughly, again, we're talking about 400 to around 800, which is kind of our cutoff here for this section. And we're picking up today with talking about some of the developments related to culture and society. And as we noted when we were talking about the 4th century, there was a lot of transition between the 3rd century and in the 4th century as Christianity gradually moved from being a religion of the marginalized to being a religion that was central, that was respected by the empire, and even became the official religion. And so as we move into the medieval period, there are kind of ways in which that is continuing to hang on as Christians are moving into more positions of power, but now, of course, as we talked about last Tuesday, the barbarians are moving into those positions, are causing some difficulties as well. And so Christianity and Christians had to face new ways of thinking, but also new things to think about, particularly when it came to culture and society. Right? Now that you are the official religion of the empire, where there's no distinction between you and the empire, how do you deal with those issues? And of course, there's also this transition that's going on as Rome has declined, has fallen, gradually getting rid of the Western Roman Empire, and so Christians in the western part of Europe having to deal with different realities, Christians in the eastern part of the empire dealing with different realities as well. In the West, there was, as you might expect, a decline in Roman culture. Essentially, the barbarians who had been very interested in Roman culture did not necessarily want to see a lot of elements of Roman society disappear. But they didn't have the ability, the cultural tools, so to speak, to keep Roman culture alive. That was just not something that they were equipped for because of how they had lived prior to taking over Rome. The decline, however, was gradual and not immediate. And so as these Germanic tribes tried to keep up elements of Roman culture, they were unable to do so, and eventually those things began to disappear. The church, on the other hand, had interwoven Christianity and culture, and so it is the cultural institution that preserves much of Roman society, essentially keeping up some Roman customs and Christianizing others. Maybe things that we would even look back and say, well, that's not really something that was a positive remnant. Maybe that should have been gotten away with. Additionally, the role of the Bishop of Rome is continuing to rise. Popes, as they will be called, continue to exert more and more authority. As we mentioned when we were talking about the political situation, Pope often became the political leader in Rome because the civil government was so weak. And a lot of this is reflected in a document known as the Donation of Constantine. Essentially, the document claimed that Constantine had given certain areas or tracts of land to the Bishop of Rome. And this area became known as St. Peter's Patrimony, or the Papal States, giving the Pope not just religious authority, but political authority over certain regions. Now, the document was evidently composed probably in the 8th century, so the 700s, and it was demonstrated during the Renaissance that the document was actually a forgery that had been developed. And so what we see here is this cultural change, this cultural shift that Christians are having to deal with. Let's look at a couple of things related to this. Let's spend some time first of talking about the papacy. Essentially, the papacy did not appear, dropped from the heavens with the Pope in charge of Rome and the church in the West under his guidance. Instead, of course, as we've seen, the office of the papacy was a gradual development that took several centuries and was not something that was accepted very easily by all Christians, especially those in the eastern part of the empire. But gradually there is this consolidation of leadership in the person of the Bishop of Rome. Not only with respect to, he's a leader of a congregation or a leader of a city, but the recognition, the belief that this leader should be the leader, the human leader of the church on earth. There were several different strands that worked their way into the argument for centralization in the papacy. First had to do with the role of Peter. With the development of belief in apostolic tradition and apostolic succession as providing a certain level of legitimating authority, who would stand at the head of the apostles but Peter? And so Peter, of course, is given a lot of respect through those early centuries. And when you look at the role of Peter in the New Testament, he does play a prominent role. Certainly, I would say that maybe this is being emphasized too much, but definitely Peter does appear as a leader among the apostles. Probably not necessarily any sort of leader over the apostles, but definitely a leader among the apostles. And this is recognized in a variety of things that happen in the Gospels, and Peter's role there. And of course, the connection that Peter eventually has to Rome was a part of this complex as well, right? So there's his leadership role in the New Testament. He's tied to Rome. So would the church tied to Rome, or a church tied to Peter, be a leader among churches in the world? And then, of course, you also have the role of Paul connected with Rome, and so that too was a part of this. So Peter has a prominent role throughout these early centuries. Then, of course, is the development of the monarchical episcopate. That one bishop over a congregation instead of a group of elders over a congregation. And so gradually there's this development. And as we talked about before, it's unclear exactly how that developed, how it moved from what appeared to be a plurality of leadership in congregations to one leader over a church. Perhaps it was that one bishop bore more of the responsibility in some places, particularly in places where heretics were causing the most trouble. And so there was kind of one leader among the church to kind of really stand up and fight the heretics, and so maybe that is how it developed. Maybe the oldest member of the group of elders, the senior member, and the elder that served the longest, maybe that position or that person started to get more respect, and it transitioned into the monarch or monoepiscopate. It could have been dealing with a variety of things related to representatives. If a church has to send a representative to another town to ordain somebody, if a church needs to write to another church, who's going to do the writing? And so the selection of one individual. Perhaps it was that as traveling apostles settled down, like Peter in Rome, John perhaps in Ephesus, they certainly would have been given a lot of respect as apostles, and perhaps even individuals kind of chosen as their successors, and that kind of becoming an office as opposed to any sort of other type of situation. Additionally, transitions in how Matthew 16:18 was interpreted also play a part of this. Now, you might not know off the top of your head what Matthew 16:18 says, but this is the passage in which Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then after that, Jesus tells him in chapter 16:18 that Simon is going to be named Peter, and upon this rock, and of course the play on Peter's name and the Greek word for rock being similar. And so upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And then also talking about whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Right? And so this passage, what does it mean that Peter receives the keys of the kingdom? What does it mean when Jesus says, upon this rock? What rock is Jesus talking about that he's going to build his church? Now, essentially, Cyprian kind of started some of this transition by saying that Jesus is speaking of giving the keys of the kingdom to the bishops, because he'll argue from Matthew 18 that the same kind of authority is given to the rest of the apostles. The apostles were parallel to the bishops of Cyprian's time in the 3rd century. And so there's something about the leadership of the bishops that's important. Origen, on the other hand, said that this word was spoken to all Christians, that the rock is faith in Christ, certainly not Peter. Well, the mainstream church, especially in the West, tended to follow Cyprian and associating the authority that Jesus is giving to the bishops. Right? And so the idea of these bishops being important, so the rise of this individual bishopric. And then, of course, building off of that, well, who would be more important than out of the bishops? Peter, and the bishop that follows after Peter. Additionally, through those first 4 centuries, Rome gradually became more of an important religious location, as it offered guidance in the question of what to do about lapsed Christians, as it emphasized the need for unity among the church, particularly unity with Rome, as it took the leadership in issues like the dating of Easter. When should Easter be celebrated? Holding fast as an Orthodox church despite the Arian controversy that was taking place. And of course the stability that was present in Rome because of its close association with the capital city. And so Rome, the city of Rome, had a lot of religious authority. A lot of people looked to it for guidance. But despite the increasing religious role, there was also a diminished political role. The Council of Constantinople, for example, declared that Constantinople was the new Rome, and that it was second only to the city of Rome religiously. And so it was kind of Rome and then Constantinople. And often the rank of a bishop was related to the city's rank, right? And so cities that were more well respected, the bishops were more well respected. But at the time we're talking about, this kind of transitionary period, the 4th century into the Middle Ages, Milan was actually the capital of the western part of the empire throughout the 4th century. After the Council of Rome, of course, Rome continued to claim its primacy, but Rome, even though it is declining politically, is still central in many ways. If you think about the spread of Christianity, Rome seems to be in the center of all that. And Ferguson said that its voice could be heard everywhere. And even as the Eastern Church is moving to the patriarchy model, where you have different cities, patriarchates, Rome, of course, was still recognized as one of those 5 great patriarchies. Constantine's rule, of course, encouraged centralization. As he's solidifying the government, there's kind of that parallel solidifying of the church. After the 380s, the Bishop of Rome continues to assert every so often the primacy. But there's lots of opposition. In fact, the word pope was related to a child's word for father. And it was used for several bishops throughout those early centuries. It appears to have been first used in Carthage by the third, or excuse me, it appears in Carthage by the 3rd century. We don't know if that was the first time it was used. But in records that we have, later it was used in Alexandria and other cities to refer to the bishop. But after the invasions, after these migrations we talked about, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, becomes the figurehead of the guardian of salvation, or civilization, I should say. It's kind of the focal point of unity in a very disunified and unstable world. And it's in that role that a bishop named Leo I really begins to solidify the papacy. He is, in some ways, we could call him the first pope. In other ways, not quite. Right? And I would argue more that the first pope would be Gregory I, who we'll talk about here in a little bit, who is a couple of centuries later. But Leo does some things that really set the stage for the invention of the papacy as we know it today. Of course, Leo tries to make some claims, and the reason why we should respect his work as setting the stage for the papacy is that he's one of these individuals really making a lot of these claims regarding the authority of the bishop in Rome. Some of that is bolstered by his work as a negotiator. Right, when we talk about the Huns as they come through, it's Leo who goes out and negotiates with Attila to try and prevent the destruction of the city. When the Vandals come through, it is also Leo who goes and attempts to negotiate. Right? So he's acting as a governmental emissary, suggesting not just religious authority, but political authority as well. And so he's recognized as an authority. So not only does he have authority, he also begins to claim authority for himself. And some of this is related in the document that's known as Sermon 3. Essentially, in Sermon 3, Leo begins to lay the groundwork for the primacy of the Bishop of Rome and why the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, should be the leadership. And a lot of this is based on Roman inheritance laws. That there is that need for that heir, and what does the authority that the heir has? Right? And so a lot of this, of course, is connected with the role of Peter. Peter has the keys of the kingdom, argues Leo. Peter is the successor, the representative, or the vicar of Christ. And so because Peter is the successor of Christ, the Bishop of Rome is Peter's direct successor. Right? That notion of apostolic succession. So the Bishop of Rome is the successor of Christ, the representative, the vicar of Christ, because he's the successor to Peter. The fact that Peter is given the keys to the kingdom gives him authority over all the other apostles, argued Leo. And in fact, he went so far as to claim that Peter's mystical presence still existed in Rome. It was as if Peter himself spoke through the Bishop of Rome. Now, of course, you have this idea that Cyprian had advanced, that when Jesus gave the keys, he was giving them to all the apostles, and the bishops are the successors to the apostles. Leo, however, says, no, that's true, but that authority came through Peter and not directly from Jesus. And so when Jesus extends that authority, he extends it through Peter instead of a direct authority from Jesus to the other apostles. Leo also notes that each bishop is responsible for the individual churches that he has the leadership over. And in the day of judgment would have to give an account of how he led. But the Bishop of Rome was responsible for all of the churches and would have to give an account to God for the entire church and not just the church at Rome.